Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a very, very special episode of Fraud O'Clock, a podcast by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners South Africa. Now, I always mention that each and every episode is very special, but today is one for the books, everybody. I am your host, Zakhonas, and joining me today, we have Miss Zakhona Mvelase, a trailblazer in her own right. So, Zakhona, thank you very much for coming.
Greetings, Katlecha. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So I will just be introducing Zakhona, everybody, just highlighting the amazing work that she has done. But before we dive into that, I just want to read a bit of a bio for everybody. So Zakhona is a seasoned anti-corruption practitioner and has spent over a decade in the field of governance and anti-corruption in South Africa. She's an internationally certified fraud examiner and holds a master's degree from Harvard University. She's an awardee of the Harvard South Africa Fellowship, which is a fellowship that is awarded to mid-careers who model ethical leadership, knowledge sharing, and serve as a resource to improve and transform their communities. She's also an awardee of John F. Kennedy Fellowship from Harvard Kennedy School, which she received in recognition of her outstanding academic achievement and professional promise with significant distinction. She has special interest in the research of interface of gender and corruption and finding context-responsive solutions. In 2021, she founded African Women Against Corruption Network, which is acronymed AWAKEN. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, absolutely.
To amplify the voice of women against corruption in Africa and focus the lens on the impact of corruption on women and girls. Zakhona leads the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNAC, or is it?
UNCAC.
ONICAC. All right, thank you for that. Coalition Task Force on Mainstreaming Gender in Corruption, Anti-Corruption Frameworks. In 2023, Zakhona was selected as an Eisenhower Global Fellow, recognizing her as an emerging global leader committed to creating a world more peaceful, prosperous, and just.
Oh my goodness, that's a mouthful.
Thank you, Zakhona. So before we dive into the thick of things, I just want to know, from your bio, we've seen what you have done, but we just want to know, what is Zakhona busy with at the moment?
Zakhona is currently growing African Women Against Corruption Network. I think when African Women Against Corruption Network, which you have rightfully stated, awaken, is awakening nations. Right. When we first started, we thought it was going to be just awakening women, right? And it's been interesting to see just the growth of African Women Against Corruption Network and looking into really people getting into the thick of things, of wanting to understand and be empowered, looking into the interface of gender and corruption.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Now, since we're on that note of Awaken, what inspired the inception of it, and how have you seen that transform the anti-corruption landscape?
Katleha, you've already stated that I had spent quite a significant amount of time in the anti-corruption space in South Africa. And, having spent that over a decade, you start, getting a little bit preoccupied when you look at the participation ratios when it comes to women and men when we're looking into the anti-corruption space. And for me, that became particularly, problematic in a sense that, when you look at all the, all the research says to us that women suffer more from corruption than any other gender. But when it comes to solving the problem, the people who are affected by the problem are not there. So when we created African Women Against Corruption Network, we looked to say, how do we create a platform where women's perspectives are being recognized when it comes to corruption, and also understanding the role that women had when it comes to corruption and when it comes to anti-corruption efforts. And so that's how really African Women Against Corruption Network began. It was really looking into how do we create a platform that focuses the lens on the impact of corruption on the impact of corruption on women and girls, and also, taking into cognizance the fact that women have historically been seen as, in just two categories when it comes to, when it comes to corruption, whereby you find that women are only seen as either victims of corruption or beneficiaries of corruption. But we've never really thought of women as, the agents of change against corruption. So we wanted to create a space where women are, recognized as the necessary agents of change that we need, particularly because, if you are saying that women, if research tells us that women suffer more from corruption than men, what are the drivers of that? Understanding the drivers of that, and also not only understanding the drivers of that, but also to say, how do we then get to understand corruption from the lens of women? So that's really what African Women Against Corruption Network is about.
I like how you mentioned that, women are only seen in two categories, whereby they're either victims of fraud or, seen as beneficiaries. But we've seen that in available reports, whistleblowers are predominantly females. So they're playing a more active role in curbing the flight of fraud. What could be the reason for women being so active, in curbing fraud? And what does that say about the ethical disparity between, male and females?
It's interesting that you asked that question, Katlego, especially because, there's been much debate surrounding that, whether or not women are more ethical than men. And, and maybe as a preface, right, African Women Against Corruption Network is not really just saying that women are the ones who are more ethical than men, but what we are saying is that they cannot be left behind when we are working towards solutions for anti-corruption in our society. But what's interesting about your opinions surrounding the ethical disparities is that behavioral studies have shown us looking into whether or not there's a gender that is ethically more inclined to act in an ethical way or not. They actually that research is actually inconclusive, right? In a sense that, some research say that women are the ones who are more likely to report on corruption, and some research says that men are more likely to report on corruption, which is very interesting in a way.
So we have a bit of a stalemate.
Exactly, we have a bit of a stalemate. But what research does reach consensus on is the fact that, there's no gender that sort of is in a superior, morality form, so it's almost like all of us are the same. But what is also interesting is that when it comes to then whistleblowing and reporting on corruption is that, they've also found that there are different, there are various factors that sort of inform whether or not a person reports on corruption, and they vary from your context. They vary from the demographics. They vary to your social factors, such as your age, your level of education, your level of income. So there's a lot of factors that come into play. And interestingly enough, there's a recent study that found that women sort of report on corruption when they are victims, right? And men report on corruption when they are witnesses, which is a story for another day as well, right? Which is a story for another day. But it's a very interesting, sort of format to just look at it in that way.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I will just come back to that point again. So why does society alienate women that, actually do report on fraud, women that are actually whistleblowers? I mean, if you look at the cases of your Sarika Lacrage, Silo Mutepu, and the late Babita, I feel like society should be doing more towards helping those women. But I think from what we see is that they are alienating women. So why do you think that also may be the case?
Interestingly enough, it's because you must remember that women are now, historically women have not been involved in a sort of, economic chain of things, in society. And now that women are getting to be involved in the economic chains, and they are often seen as outsiders, and they have this outsider status. And, you are coming into these collusive networks that have been there, that are ingrained, and that are sort of male-centric. So when you come in and you start reporting on the things that have been happening, for decades, right? And you start saying this is wrong and this is wrong, and so what that then does is that it gives women this sort of you are coming to be a rat in some of some sort, because these things have been here. We know how we deal with each other. We know how we deal with corruption, and we know how to perceive what's happening, in these male-centric relationships. So that's where the problem starts, right? It starts from us having that outsider status when it comes to these, to these economic, situations that we find ourselves in, and participating in the economy. Yes.
Thank you very much for that. I feel like that provides a very insightful look or another perspective into how we can look at things. So from also going back to Awaken, from the perspective of Awaken, we want to know that how has South Africa or the South African community received your anti-corruption efforts? I know that you're very active in communities, especially towards girls, and yeah, how has society just accepted that?
Interestingly enough, Katlego, when I founded African Women Against Corruption Network, it was 3 years ago, and I think people kept on asking me, do you want to speak about corruption? Do you want to take this conversation to the layman on the street? And I said to and I used to say, but why not, right? Why not bring the conversation to the people where it belongs, right? And this is really truly because people often feel very detached. When we talk about corruption, and we put a number on it. If you look at the CPI, South Africa is number 43, but people don't even know why South Africa is number 43 in the CPI, right?
I feel like it doesn't affect them.
Exactly, right? And also when people think about corruption, they look at corruption from a sense that, okay, it's something that's happening, out there. It's like a conversation that's supposed to be happening at the top, but not a conversation that's happening, at the bottom. So I think we have phrased corruption to look into the grand scheme of corruption, right? But not necessarily your day-to-day corruption, which is how a layman on the street interacts with corruption. And so what we then wanted to do, we wanted to say, how do we create a platform, especially for those who are not even thinking about corruption and who are affected by corruption? It was interesting when, I started doing research on just the role of women and the anti-corruption space in corruption. And you found that women interpreted corruption as an act of kindness, right? And the reason for that is because they've never they've never known better, right? And, when you ask a layman on the street, they'll say, no, but corruption exists. It should be here because these are the things, it's been there, for decades or for centuries, right? So who are you to think that it could, something can be done now? But, just now starting to have these conversations and also bringing people into the platform and bringing people into the conversation. Now they feel part of the solution, right? Now they know that they have a role to play when it comes to corruption, and particularly working with women. I always say that, when Awaken started, we didn't think that, people actually wanted to have these conversations. And these are the things that people always ask you, how did you know that people wanted to speak about corruption? It was interesting that, from our very first, event that we had, it was oversubscribed, right? Oh. And it was oversubscribed by people that you would not otherwise think they want to sit at the anti-corruption table. But people wanted to speak about corruption, and people wanted to speak about how it affects them. And when you now start talking about, gendered forms of corruption, where now people are they don't even feel detached from it because it happens to them, right? The bribe currency then becomes you. Then people get interested, right? To say, but something needs to be done about this. And I'm going to be part of any solution that comes that's going to bring this matter to the fore.
And you provided that platform.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And I like how you touched on the point that, most people in communities feel very detached, and they feel like, corruption is a distant problem, which I also just like to, enlighten them. I can't remember the exact figure, but in South Africa, I know, we lose billions, and if we're able to actually conceptualize that, I think with that money that was lost due to fraud, we could have actually built 2.4 million houses, 2.4 million houses. So, with the rampant, unemployment that we have, homelessness, that money could have been channeled differently, but alas, it's lost. Moving back to what you mentioned about, fraud being so distant from communities, I found that it's quite stigmatized. It's quite stigmatized, and I applaud you, for bringing or actually, initiating those conversations, and those talks in communities, which actually makes me wonder what motivated, this particular interest in studying the relationship between corruption and gender.
It's what's interesting is that I stumbled upon I stumbled upon this topic, this particular topic, and the reason how I stumbled upon it was when I started having these questions surrounding the role of women, right, and saying, what does corruption look like from the lens of women? And from then on, that's when I started to sort of research, what does corruption look like in terms of how women view corruption as, and also, the forms of corruption that directly target women, not necessarily that they target women alone, but they disproportionately target women, and also how that then comes into play. And that's when I then stumbled upon gendered forms of corruption, particularly sexual corruption. And it was such an interesting thing because, I belong to, I have a group of friends, and when, I stumbled upon this topic, I then said to, a few of them, I asked them, guys, what do you think of this? Do you even think of, would you even think of it as corruption? And these are people in the anti-corruption space. And the interesting part was that, when you started, the general definition of corruption is abuse of entrusted power to obtain, for private gain, right? And when you started now including sexual corruption into the mix, it sort of distorted to many people, the framework of corruption as we knew it, because corruption has always been seen as, in financial terms and in economic terms. But now when you involve other currencies, people start to say, okay, is that corruption, right? They move to morality, then it is a crime, which is also how then, these crimes become so normalized, right? Because we have not acknowledged them, right? And they're crimes are more dangerous when they when they don't get acknowledged, right?
Yes.
When we let them, just remain hidden in plain sight. And that's what was happening. And so when we started these conversations, it was very interesting to see that, once you introduce the topic of sexual corruption, people they know exactly what you're talking about, right? They just never saw it as corruption.
Precisely.
They saw it as everything else as corruption, but corruption. And what was even more interesting was the fact that we even report on it, but we don't report on it as corruption. So if you look at, various media publications that talk about sexual corruption instances, they don't call it sexual corruption. They call it everything else. They'll say sex for jobs, sex for grades, sex for food, sex for this, sex for that. And they make, sex to be the conversation, but not the abuse of power, right? Which then, removes and detaches corruption from the subject, right? So we then, you mentioned that, I lead the United Nations, the UNCAC coalition on mainstreaming gender and anti-corruption frameworks. So when we started with this work, we then said, what, let us start to, to bring to the conversation of sexual corruption the fact that this is an abuse of power, right? And whether or not it's something that a person has received, or it's been offered to you, or you have requested it, it is still corruption, right? And let us look at it from that particular point of view, which is something that has been I think it's the work that I think I'm proud of, because from that we have been able to also sort of make recommendations to, the UN signatories to say, let us now start having corruption and gender being spoken about in the same context, Absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I think we're running pressed on time at the moment. So, Zakhona, just one last question for you. You're such an avid, active player, in the anti-corruption space. How would you say your, CFE designation has assisted you in, in any way? What role has that played in your career?
I mean, CFE is where it all started, right? So, I think I could remember the times I got certified in 2011, right? So I could remember the times when I attended my first conference, right? Oh. It was like, you'd have 30% ratio of women and 70% of men in the room, right? And that's when you're like, okay, but this is a very good platform. But where are women, right? Why are women not at this table? Because it is a very good platform.
It is.
So, that's when these questions really started to say, how do we include more women in the anti-corruption space? But then it sort of morphed into other things, and to now me focusing on gendered forms of corruption. But really, that's where it all started. And I think I still recognize myself as a CFE because I think it's a designation that, it really takes you places.
It really takes you
internationally. Yes,
internationally.
Absolutely.
Okay,
yes.
Fantastic. Well, I would just like to make a note there that, the numbers are growing in women. I've seen that. If you are to look at our integrated report that we publish on a yearly basis, the numbers are there. Males are still dominating the industry, but, not very much. Mm-hmm. Not very much. It's almost, reaching an equal level. So we are proud of that. And I'm sure much of that is also the efforts that you're also putting into the industry. So well done on that. I applaud you.
Thank you.
Okay, and I think that is a wrap from us. Thank you very much for joining us, Zakhona. Thank you for availing yourself.
Thank you for having me.
We hope to have you on another episode soon.
Absolutely.
And that's it, everybody.
Let's get awakened.
We'll definitely get awakened, everybody. And where can people reach you?
We are on all social media networks.
Okay.
We are on Twitter, and it's Awaken_Africa. On Facebook, it's African Women Against Corruption Network. LinkedIn, African Women Against Corruption Network. Instagram, it's Awaken_Africa.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you.
And where can people get you?
They can visit our website. It's www.awaken.africa. And I think we've got a very good team who is very responsive. Okay. So
and
they'll
your
be able
profile is also on the website.
Absolutely.
All right, fantastic. That's it. You have it, everybody. Do not forget to hit the subscribe, the like button. The podcast will also be aired on our website. That's www.acfesa.co.za. Thank you, everybody. Take notes. Take care. See you guys on the next episode of Protoclock. That's a wrap. Thank you.
Thank you.